Okay, we're moving from expert insiders to very knowledgeable outsiders, in a sense. Citizens in Science, How Reproducibility Directly Impacts Public Perceptions. The workshop organizers all agreed this was a critical component of our discussion today and tomorrow because it's often, if not always, public money that supports science with great expectations for positive benefit in return. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Bazell, currently at Yale University, as our first speaker.
Thank you very much. Before I open the slide, I just want to say, well, there's the slide. Okay, I'm only going to have one slide, and that's this one that you've probably seen it a lot of times before. This is from Jim Borgman, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist. And when you talk about what the public's perception of science is, this says it all to me. Because for the most part, in my opinion, and first of all, before I proceed, even though my bio is in the pamphlet, where I come from is relevant to what I'm about to say. I was trained as a scientist at Berkeley, and then I ran away to become a reporter for Science magazine, and then I became a science correspondent for television for a long time. So I've been looking at it with a bit of history, and now I'm back in academia in the twilight of my long career here. So that's my qualifications, and I was only told what I was supposed to talk about here last night, which is not much of a, I don't mean to criticize the, the organizers, but I don't, this is, if my preparation is as smooth as the two that preceded, I apologize for that. But I want to say that for the two that preceded me were Dr. McLeod and Dr. Ron, were just brilliant insights into what's going on in science. And I would also posit, and I have no evidence to base this, and maybe now that I'm at Yale I can find some colleagues to go out and do the kind of surveys to base this, but I think that that stuff is of no interest to the public at all right now. I think that the public, for the most part, is not concerned about this. They want cures or better treatments for the diseases that afflict them. They want to know what toxins in their environment are a threat to them, and that's what they care about. I think that the biggest problem that's facing, and I would love to hear their response to both of the things that you two said, is that most of the response to it was the fourth response that you had, Dr. Braun, which was that let's just hope it starts up again. You know, let's just hope that we go back to 10% a year. And I was fascinated by the 10% a year figure because you've all heard of Bernie Madoff, who from about 1970 had rates of return of 10% every year. And after he was arrested for running one of the world's biggest Ponzi schemes, everybody said, well, how could you possibly believe that this man was giving 10% a year returns? And the same thing was true for science. They kept thinking that this was never going to end, and where was it coming from? And it seems blatantly obvious that a lot of the problems about reproducibility that you just heard, and you'll hear about in the next talk, have to do with this gigantic expansion of science. Because one of the things that I do at Yale is I spend a lot of time with young scientists, mostly with postdocs, and they're so terrified about their futures that, and you all know this from your own institutions, that most of them are just coming and some of them are actually literally in tears about it. Tell me what should I do? What's going to happen? I'm certainly not going to get a faculty position because they know they're not going to get that publication. And so that's all. That is all what's going on in the world of science. To the extent that that's known to the public, I think it's, from my own completely off the top of my head observations, that is not what the public perceives. This is what the public perceives. The public perceives a situation which involves mostly epidemiology, where things are changing all the time. And it leads to an enormous cynicism about epidemiology in particular, but that leads to cynicism about science in general. And that's where there is a problem with that. And the reason for this situation has to do with the growth of science and things over time, and some of the pressures to publish and the other things that we've heard about. It was in 1950, a long time ago, that in Graham and Winder in the United States and Dahl and Pito in the UK published the results that was a case-controlled study, hospital patients, the human beings, we're not talking about animals here, that they took a bunch of people who had lung cancer in the hospital and a bunch of people who didn't have lung cancer, and they compared them, and it just jumped out at them. I mean, it took a long time and a lot of industry battles that we're all familiar with until it was finally resolved, but that was really clear. And for all the problems that you can have with case-controlled studies, recall bias, confounding factors, and everything else, there was no issues with those studies. I mean, the issues were what industry did afterwards, and that's well known. But the idea that epidemiology, I mean, some people think that epidemiology started with Percival Pott in the 18th century, and a century later with John Snow taking the pump off the Broad Street, taking the handle off the Broad Street pump to stop a cholera epidemic, but really epidemiology started after the Second World War. And it started with those studies. It started with the Framingham Heart Study, where the longitudinal studies were done also here in Britain as well as in the United States to start finding causes of disease. But the thing about these was that they did not look for an effect like smoking and lung cancer. Heavy smokers, depending on how heavy the smoking is, have a 20 to 40 increase in risks of developing lung cancer. We all know that. It's well known now. It's a fairly easy, talk about low-hanging fruit. This was an easy effect to find. It wasn't so obvious then, but it was very easy to find. But that led to a whole lot of understandable desire to use the same sorts of techniques to find out about all these other things that go on in life, and where you're looking for effects that even if they're there, and whether they are is always hugely questionable. You're talking about a 1.2 or 20% increase, not a 2,000 to 4,000% increase of relative risk, and that has to do with toxins and it has to do with benefits. There's nothing more enlivening for reporters than to try to get people to talk about things that people really care about. Like, for instance, are carbs or fats better or worse for your diet, and which is more effective in causing weight gain or loss, and which is more effective, which is more important in the epidemic of obesity? The truth is that despite some 600,000 papers on this subject, nobody really knows, and it goes on and on. It's really hard to look for these things, and the reason that, and this leads to the old saw, first they tell us something is good for us, and the next day they tell us something is not very good for us. And that is the cynicism that this generates. And I think that that's where the problem is. I think that since I started working for Science Magazine in 1970, the year you mentioned, every year, there has never been a single year when science as a group has not complained, oh my God, we're underfunded, the new dark ages are coming, the sky is falling. It is consistent. It's the most consistent thing I've seen across all kinds of science, is that the things that the last two speakers highlighted are never mentioned. They are never mentioned out loud for fear that some members of the public, and thereby then some members of Congress, even worse, are going to find out about it and say, well, maybe there's a better, more expensive, less expensive, streamlined way that you can do this to be more effective. Anybody who was running an industry or a business to produce something would be thinking in those terms. How can we do this better? How can we do this more effective? But there's this idea that there's something so magical about science and the scientific method that it'll just throw more money at it and it'll do better. But it hasn't. It's led to what is 25,000 journals and 3,000 papers published a day, and people getting whatever. Even if they can get a horrible job from a good institution, they get it by publishing something. So they have every motivation to fudge their results. So yes, I think as a group, scientists have to start thinking about how to do it better and more effectively, and maybe even maybe even with less money, God forbid. I mean, I say that, but it's like you get Research America, and right near here, I might send a lightning bolt in and strike me dead for saying that. But because we all get emails from Mary Woolley, whoever she is, every day saying that how much more needs to be given to science. So these things come about for reasons you're all familiar with the problems with epidemiology. But I think that's the problem that the public sees. But the problem that is really the big problem is the ones that we just heard about. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker for this session is Jan Piotrowski with The Economist, based in Sao Paulo currently. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Jan to the podium.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an absolute honor. I too used to be an academic before I turned to the dark side about 4 years ago, but mine was a nice and fluffy discipline of the philosophy of language. But I do sort of understand the inner workings and the incentive system as it works in the academia. I was an academic at Warsaw University, but from what I've seen since I started reporting on science for The Economist, it seems that everywhere pretty much follows the same script. Now, as Steve mentioned, I'm now in Sao Paulo. So the reason I'm here is that I wrote a story for The Economist last October. Actually, I wrote it about 2 years earlier, but it took about 18 months to come to fruition, mainly because it had the great virtue and the great bane of being unpegged. So whenever something happened, especially a coup in Egypt, which displaced me twice, at two different times, 3 months apart, it was shoved in the drawer and waiting for a more propitious moment. Now, since then, however, I have moved to Sao Paulo, where I'm now the bureau chief, no longer reporting on science, reporting on just about anything other than science. But the move to Sao Paulo did make one thing about science reporting extremely clear to me. So the moment you start writing about politics or economics or social matters, you realize that you, as a reporter, weave the narrative. You take bits and pieces from different parts of what you see, and you create the story. Now, when I was a science reporter for The Economist, the research imposed the narrative on you. And that's because science is authoritative. The reason we, for instance, at The Economist often rely just on the researchers themselves and not necessarily on any supporting sources, which many of you might find odd, but this is the way it works, is that if something is published in a peer-reviewed journal, especially one of the top-notch, we expect it to be authoritative. I don't remember this. I'm Polish. I don't remember this because I was born in 1979, and when communism fell in 1989, I wasn't a big fan of scientific literature yet. But I was told that in those days, my parents would tell me that whenever there was a scientific result which was presented in the press, it was always preceded by the trope, Soviet scientists have discovered, and that was basically a stamp of approval. After 1989, that changed to American scientists have discovered, and basically that it has remained so since then. That stamp of authority is extremely important, especially as science gets more and more bizarre. When we report on something wacky, in fundamental physics, or quantum mechanics, for instance, you need that stamp of approval, because if not, it would just be, it's fairy tales. I mean, it really does look like fairy tales most of the time. So that stamp of authority is absolutely critical in the reporting of science. The content of science. There are two types of science reporting, right? There's one which reports on the content of research, and the other on the doing of research. But I, in my career as a science journalist, certainly focus, but perhaps apart from the big piece that I wrote, focused on the content of research, on what results researchers were finding. The other part of reporting is how research is done, but that typically does not really delve into the scientific method. What it looks at is really, is there any fraud that is committed? Fraud is always great news, although in truth, it is probably I'm absolutely certain, in fact, that it's much less prevalent among scientists than it is in just about any other type of human enterprise. Second, it's about funding. So those are the two sort of process stories, if you will, that you get in science reporting. Now, the problem with the story that I wrote, and the only reason I wrote it is not that I got some hot tip from a scientist, is that basically you guys started speaking up about it. In the past few years, more and more people have been doing research of the sort that Malcolm has presented, showing the deficiencies in the method and suggesting that these deficiencies might be the result of certain misaligned incentives in the academe. Now, reporting about that is difficult, and the reason it's difficult is because, well, for a start, it requires a basic, well, if I were to report about it to a lay audience, it requires, for instance, a basic grasp of statistics from probability. Because a lot of these problems stem from either the inappropriate use of statistics and probability or from the misunderstanding of statistics and probability by scientists themselves, which is a problem I believe Victoria Stodden is going to be talking tomorrow. And I had a great chat with her about this when I was working on that piece. So you can imagine that it's only an even bigger problem among the general population. Now, some might say that it might be somewhat less of a problem than average for readers of The Economist, who include a lot of bankers and other people involved in risks, but after 2008, that's probably debatable. Now, when we start reporting about the deficiencies of science, science reporters are torn, because first, well, the scientific methods and the problems, they're dear to our hearts because we want the enterprise to succeed for the most part, right? We care about science. We also spend a lot of time around scientists, and we have a lot of confidence in you guys as a result, because by and large, the people I've met in my 3.5 years covering science for The Economist, they're all extremely sincere, extremely hardworking, extremely intelligent people. Or at least that's the impression they gave, as did Bernie Madoff, I'm sure. And we are especially torn at a time when confidence, general public confidence in science seems to be at something of an ebb. There was, I think, a poll back in 2011, but these are repeated all the time. 69% of Americans are skeptical about the claims that climate scientists make. Bob spoke about epidemiology and a constant churn of advice based on epidemiological research. It basically spreads onto other disciplines of science. And in the latest report published in April, I believe, 50% of Americans expressed doubts in the Big Bang. Right, 40% expressed doubts in that the universe began with the Big Bang. 40% expressed doubts about evolution. At a time like this, it is very hard for a science journalist who cares about science to talk about science's problems. But maybe the one bit of good news from that poll, that latest poll, was that medical research, or at least sort of the established facts of medical research, such as, for instance, that vaccines are not bad for you and effective, is taken for granted by the majority of those polled, and that, for instance, only 15%, or actually no, only about 5% of people question the link between smoking and lung cancer. So there is maybe something of a silver lining, and that silver lining could be because biomedical sciences are slightly less politicized than the questions of the existence and evolution and creation. But second of all, it could be because people, the lay audience, if you will, the general population, has actually been experiencing the fruits of science for a very long time. So they're familiar with the technology works, the vaccines work, people who stop smoking, few of them get lung cancer. It's all relatively straightforward, right? Many of science is terribly complicated, but a lot of these things, the results speak for themselves after a while, at least. Now, a lot of the reason why these treatments are effective is, of course, because a lot of them were born of animal research. I don't want to talk too much about animal research for a start because I don't know very much about it. I know a little bit more about the problems of reproducibility, but coming from Sao Paulo. One thing that met me on my arrival in January was an announcement by the governor of the state of Sao Paulo that he will ban animal research in the state, which is 42 million persons strong and is a huge economy. So it's responsible for about a third of economic production in Brazil, which is staggering. So. He did that because of a kerfuffle that broke up back in October over beagles. Activists freed, I wasn't there at the time, but from what I understand, activists broke into a corporate laboratory and freed 178 cute beagles, which were used for tests. And that obviously led to a huge outcry, generalized outcry over animal testing. Now, one of the justifications that the governor gave for his move was that there are now many other ways to do the same sort of thing. For instance, you can do a lot of things in vitro. You can create sort of biochemical models. You can use computer modeling. Now, this again is probably our fault. We overhype a lot of things, and most recently the use of big data to create very complicated models of living organisms, for instance. Now, the point at which those models will become as good as in vivo models is still some way away, as all of you are no doubt aware. But and it is partly our task not to overhype, but at the same time we have to present these new advances, because those new advances are what our readers are interested in. We are worse than the glam mags, as one British boffin named Science and Nature and the like, because our credo, in fact, is to simplify and exaggerate. So where Science and Nature pick the snazziest of scientific findings, we pick the snazziest of the snazziest. Statistically, they are the most likely to be false. But that's what our editors want. That's what the readers want to read. Nobody wants to read about a replicated result or a lack of replication, unless it's something like the Piketty data or Reinhardt and Rogoff a few years ago, or a year ago. So that for us is a huge conundrum. How do you, on the one hand, report science and try to tell readers about just how complex it is, without undermining the reader's confidence in it, and actually persuading our editors to publish the things that we write? And I think it's a perennial problem, and it's probably only getting worse, unfortunately. But at the same time, hopefully, people are getting a little bit, the general population is getting a little bit better educated. They're getting more of these stories. And again, I only followed, I did not lead. It is you, scientists, who are finally sort of making it very clear that something is awry with the scientific enterprise as it stands, and we science journalists therefore have the authority to talk about it now. Thank you.
Now to the audience participation portion of this section. Again, please use the microphones and identify yourself with a comment or question. Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul Locke from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm required to say that 3 times at every meeting, so this is my second time.
And it's good to know it hasn't changed from the first time.
Right. Given the way science is going.
Well, there are people who have multiple affiliations these days, so you can sort of mix and match.
I could, yes. My question, really, I want to probe you guys on is communicating with the public. I've had the opportunity to go and talk with the public about scientific issues, and it's always an interesting conversation. And when I speak with a lot of my colleagues who are in the sciences, they have a communications theory that as experts, if they just educate the public, then things will change. My bias is that that's dead bang wrong. And my question to you is, tell me why I'm wrong or tell me why I'm right, and more importantly, tell us how we can do a better job explaining to the public how science works and what to expect.
The one thing that becomes, well, I only was a science journalist for 3 years, so I don't have Bob's sort of, historic overview of how that's changed. But the impression that I get, and from my conversations with my more veteran colleagues, it appears that scientists have really stepped up their game in this regard. I mean, the number of PR companies employed by universities, I was and still am, in fact, despite having changed my beat, flooded with information about just about any sort of research from just about any university in the world. A lot of that, unfortunately, goes to the PR churn and comes out mangled. But well, first of all, we're alerted to what scientists do, and scientists care about alerting the public. And I believe that that's, in your annual assessments these days, you're probably asked about what did you do to plug the university, essentially, to get the university's name in the paper. So that's one thing, which certainly seems to have changed. The second is that scientists are extremely well media trained these days. I wrote a lot about fundamental physics, and I spent a lot of time at CERN. And these guys, I mean, it's ludicrously complicated. I studied physics and maths at undergraduate level for a couple of years, but I never got beyond sort of the basics, really. What they do is incredibly complicated, completely counterintuitive, and very, very difficult to comprehend for anybody who doesn't have the mathematical apparatus. And yet the chosen people, the people picked for media training, do it really, really well. Now, it is our job as science journalists, because they obviously give us too much detail, right? I mean, I would love to give more detail on the niceties of neutrino physics to my readers, but it would not pass the editor test. So I need to prune it down. But so it is our task to basically take what those scientists give us and the time and effort they expend on giving it to us. I mean, I could easily spend writing many of the pieces 2 hours on the phone with a very, very patient boffin across the Atlantic, telling me about Markov chain Monte Carlo methods and computer vision. And he would very gladly do that. And not just because he finally found that somebody other than himself is interested in his research, but also because they care about the way that the public perceives what they do more and more, and rightly so. So I think there is room to be optimistic in this regard, because scientists are doing a better job at explaining what they do and how they do it, and hopefully because science journalists are doing a better job as well. Many of them have scientific or quasi-scientific backgrounds, so I'm personally quite optimistic about the public communication aspect.
I think that one of the things you're saying is a lot of movement toward training a lot of scientists to be better at it. I think that a lot of the people that are at the top of their field do it already very well. And you'll see, one of the reasons I was hired by Yale was to set up a program to teach young scientists how to communicate. And in your packet from this meeting, the AAAS has a program where they're advertising it there. So that's one thing. But I don't think it's just the way scientists communicate. And one of the reasons for the churning of epidemiology that I mentioned has to do with the institutions themselves. The institutions, as part of this spiraling process where there's more and more people trying to do more and more stuff and trying to get more published, want to get everything publicized. So one study that finds that coffee might cause problems gets immediate publicity without anything to do with the qualifiers that, hey, that this is only one of many, and and it's a small effect, and we need a lot of further studies to get a totality of evidence. And there is where I think the problem is with the scientific method, and the public wants certainty. Scientists, the very beauty of science is its uncertainty, and the fact that, except in these situations that we're hearing about today, it can usually be replicated or not. And that's where the problem is the public, and the public is not going to understand the scientific method. I don't think that there is a problem with the public. Global warming is a special case. It's new. It's very political. It's got a big industry force on the other side. And evolution is, I think, a weird one in the United States, especially because of the historical or fundamentalist Christianity. But for the most part, people have enormous respect for scientists, and they do want cures for the diseases that ail them and things like that. So they're not looking down on the scientists. The problem is that science is, if good science, is open to change, and that is not often communicated effectively.
Jerry.
Jerry Collins from Yale University. A lifetime ago, I was the university spokesperson on why animals are used in biomedical research, and through the interactions I had with the media and other groups, came to the conclusion that we really can't rely upon others to educate the public. And by others, I mean really the media. We need to depend upon ourselves. We need to be speaking with our friends and neighbors and explaining to them what it is and why we do it. So I'm curious if either of you have seen, you mentioned this improvement in the media savvy of the scientists. What's your sense of the scientists' ability to be comfortable with talking to friends and neighbors about what they do and why they do it, especially when it comes to the use of animals?
Well, you and I should get together in New Haven and talk about this in great detail, but I want to say that when I've been running these classes for the entire year now for postdocs and training sessions, and some of them are just dreadful. I mean, in their abilities to not use jargon and because one of the what we start out, and these are totally voluntary with young scientists, is say, look, let's give me a 5 minutes talk about what your research is. No PowerPoint. You can use a blackboard or the whiteboard, and it's astounding how unable many of the young people are to avoid jargon, to be clear, to tell a story in a way that a journalist is trained to tell a story, where you get a hook, you tell what the big picture is and why it's relevant. And for exactly the reasons that you said, this is really important. It's not important because these young scientists are going to end up being on CNN tonight. It's more important because when they go to their communities, when they go home to their families, and their families say, what do you do for 16 hours a day in that lab? That they're able to say it in a way that makes the other people excited about it, and that is in fact a social feature that I think we need to work on very much.
Maybe I was just fortunate, but many of the scientists I met in a social setting that were extremely eloquent and very well prepared to tell, in a nutshell, what it is that they do and why it matters. But again, I had not been doing it for as long as Bob, so my N is certainly much smaller. Now, the one thing with young scientists, I think this is probably true of all areas of expertise, but I'm sure it's certainly true of things like management. Jargon is in part, and in science, it's mainly a shorthand, right? The idea is to say more with less. So it's basically it's a shortened definition. That's jargon. But it seems that many young people like to use jargon as a way to, which is just to show off. This is especially true in philosophy, it seems, especially continental philosophy, where it's nothing but jargon, really. If you try to unpick the jargon, it turns out there's nothing there. This is my bias as an analytical sort. But I think it is very important to teach young scientists that actually they'll show off much more if they're able to clearly and concisely tell people around them what it is that they do and what matters. But young, I'm not sure how plausible that is given the competing interest in sounding smart.
Right here, please.
Polls that I've read indicate that some 80% of the public in the United States recognize that animals experience pain in ways akin to that in which humans experience pain, and that they're very concerned about that when it comes to the food that they eat and other uses of animals. So I wonder whether you feel as journalists that the lack of public concern about the reduction of animals in research environments is an issue that you ought to be addressing and raising, since the public in general recognizes the need to reduce pain and suffering, and yet in terms of their engagement with this issue, it's almost nowhere.
I think that you can cite a lot of surveys with the public, but one of the things that's fascinating is I keep getting back to the science, particularly biomedical scientists, are held in very high regard. And I'm going to get to animals in a second. But if you, 1 out of 10 Americans, only 1 in 10 Americans knows what a molecule is. And that's a fairly recent survey. So there's a lot of scientific illiteracy out there. There is a lot of emotion about animals, and that's something that you people deal with all the time. And I'm not qualified, as many people in this room are, to deal with that issue, because it's been your issue for as long as this group has been together. But I can, and it can change over time. But I still, and again, I don't have the data. Maybe we can get a survey going at Yale, but I don't think that most people really are that concerned about it. They would much rather have a treatment for the disease, and the strong anti-rights, the anti-animal people are looked down upon as kind of a fringe by most of the public. But I'd like to have some hard data to back that up.
I'm not sure whether it will, but the one thing that does seem to be occurring is that the outbursts, as in the case of Sao Paulo in October, seem to be much bigger these days than they were. And part of that is because of the social network and the general connectivity of the world. Another might be because YouTube is flooded with videos of cute kittens and puppies. And when you see, when you suddenly hear that, a cute kitten or kitten in the case of Britain a few days ago, or puppies in the case of the beagles, are being mistreated, you have scope for a greater explosion of public anger, and maybe those greater explosions of public anger could be channeled by journalists, where we would be able to demonstrate that there is in fact progress, that animals are being treated more humanely than ever, fewer are being used, and so on. But that's a hope rather than a statement.
Lita, and then Jackie.
No, you can go ahead. Sorry, couldn't resist. I've either come from the dark side or I've gone to it. I used to be a television news reporter with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Now I'm with Americans for Medical Progress. I appreciate everything you've said about science journalists, but 90% of our battle is precisely as you state, trying to translate the science on our end to journalists who are not trained as scientists. And we find that certainly the animal rights folks can either have lovely ladies take off most of their clothes and get the media coverage, or we can have someone who has an animal technician's degree go around handing out annual inspection reports and totally misinterpreting the results in there. What guidance can you offer in terms of institutions being able to deal with non-science trained journalists who are really looking just for the day's story?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that do that. As most institutions, a part of the enormous amount of money they've gotten from the NIH over the years, or the NSF have hired increasing numbers of PR people. The institutions want to, but I think that you just have to keep saying the same message. The key thing about media training is to stay on message. You've all heard that. And what's staying on message? You decide what the most effective message is. You can maybe test what the most effective message is. And you say that this, and this drug, or this, and this cure were developed in animals. It couldn't have been done in animals. That's why we need to use animals. We use them in the most humane way, and we use them sparingly. As sparingly as possible. Just keep saying it over and over again. You have no choice other than to say that, to put it in a good light, and then to say that you are aware of the problem and you respect it, but you can't. This cannot be. It's a fantasy that this could be done in test tubes or with a computer.
I think another very, very important thing, but again, this is, I'm sure, something that you learn very quickly, is that you need a lot of patience. People you talk to, especially those who are not science trained, well, they quite literally do not know anything about the stuff that you do. They need to start from scratch very often, and that sometimes requires a lot of time. I mean, as I said, I have a little bit of background, and I would still spend 2 hours. But then again, I have the luxury of working for a weekly. not for a daily or indeed a television news station. So I think patience with the reporters is absolutely crucial, and I appreciate all the patience that many scientists have given me. But then again, I also realize that a lot of the people you talk to from the animal rights lobby, for instance, will have an agenda, and whatever it is that you tell them, I mean, they will selectively use bits of what you said and selectively cut bits, and then that's really political reporting. That's not science reporting, right? So in this respect, you probably have to act like politicians rather than scientists.
Lita?
A few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, a couple of reporters founded a website called Retraction Watch. And that focuses on issues relating to fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So FFP, that's a legal issue and whatnot in the United States. How much websites like this, and this Retraction Watch gets a lot of attention by the media, I think by the scientists themselves, maybe some of the scientists, I'm not sure how many, I don't know that it has been counted ever, but efforts like this, which are focused on something that's not of comfort to most of us. Nobody likes to hear that we're not doing something right or we're not doing it the proper way. How much do you think efforts like this affect either the way we perceive ourselves as scientists or the way the public, beyond the journalists, understand what it is that we do?
I can tell you that nobody has thinner skin than journalists, for the most part, in my experience. And one of the most difficult things is if you ever make a mistake as a journalist, which we do very often, and you have to print a retraction. To have a story retracted is the most humiliating experience. So we certainly understand it. I don't think there's, again, I'm making this up off the top of my head. I have to totally confess to that. I don't think there's a lot of people out there that are paying attention to retractions. Again, it gets back to what I said at the podium. I don't think that a lot of people are paying attention to the non-reproducibility of a certain percentage of scientific results, or unless it's some major thing. I mean, when something comes along like the fact that Vioxx was approved with a very blatant ignoring of the fact that it increased the risk for heart disease that you can find in that New England Journal of Medicine paper if you go back and look for it. Those kind of things which are totally outrageous and have to do with malfeasance of big pharma. That can get a lot of attention, but that does not reflect, I don't think, on the scientific method. So I don't think that there's a whole lot of going on, in my opinion.
It's really only, I think, a milieu that will pay attention to things like Retraction Watch. And Retraction Watch is, I think, it's a very salubrious and salutary enterprise, and it should continue and will. Then again, what I said earlier with retraction, in relation to Retraction Watch in particular, retractions are a problem, but they're a tiny problem when it comes to the broader reproducibility issue. I think that papers which are retracted due to some sort of, explicit malfeasance, it pales in comparison with the sort of sloppiness that Malcolm talked about. And sloppiness is the problem. And I think it is our duty as journalists to sometimes, bash, like we bash politicians, like we bash company bosses or economists or whatnot. It is our duty to bash scientists over the head if they seem to be doing something not quite right. But I have to agree with Bob and say that I think that the vast majority of readers are less, or readers in my case, or general audience and more broadly, are much less interested in the nitty-gritty of the scientific method and its current deficiencies than they are in whether or not they should be drinking more coffee or less.
We're 30 seconds into break, so I'll ask you to be brief, and this will be our last comment.
This is really quick, but I just want to say that it seems to me that the topic we're talking about here, the real audience, is scientists. And those are the people who are the most ignorant about the problem that we're talking about, and they need to know the most about it. I think it really is largely an education thing, and any advice you guys can give us about how to do that. We're talking inside baseball, but we're really talking about how to teach the baseball players how you think about what you're doing.
Well, I'd say you just hit a no-hitter. I mean, the two talks this morning, and I think the one that Dr. Begley's talk that's going to follow, are really focusing on the issue. And until you start focusing, and journalists and everybody else will follow, but you are educating scientists, and you're educating them with data which they understand. And sooner or later, somebody's going to have to face up to the fact that these people are coming up with data that indicates that we're doing it wrong, and we need to do it better.
And maybe, just maybe, although this may be a bit of a hard sell sometimes, it is good to introduce caveats in what you tell the public. Well, caveats are important. Everybody uses caveats, but sometimes it's, you just want to get the result out there and forget about the reservations, right? Maybe you shouldn't. And that will in turn educate the public about the way that research is done. I realize this is probably ludicrously optimistic, but then again, what else can we do?
Okay. We are scheduled for a 15-minute break. We're already a little bit late, and because breaks always take longer than they're scheduled for, I'd like us to reconvene at 10:50. Please join me in thanking our second panelists this morning.